He divorced his poor wife for a billionaire, believing money would give him the perfect life. But when his fortune suddenly disappeared, the woman he abandoned became the only person who could save him. Then an old document revealed a shocking secret and a mysterious signature that changed everything. Who was really behind his downfall? Stay until the end to discover the truth. The day Daniel betrayed his wife, the rain fell like the sky itself was warning him. Miriam stood outside the courthouse beneath a broken umbrella, clutching her small brown handbag against her chest. Her simple blue dress was damp at the shoulders, and her worn shoes were stained with mud. Across the parking lot, a black luxury car stopped, and Daniel stepped out in an expensive charcoal suit. Beside him emerged Vanessa Sterling, the glamorous billionaire heiress whose name could open almost any door in the city. Miriam watched Vanessa slip her arm through Daniel's, and something inside her went painfully quiet. 3 years earlier, Daniel had married Miriam when he had nothing but a second-hand laptop and a dream. She had believed in him when everyone else laughed at his little technology company. She worked 2 jobs, cooked cheap meals, and even sold her favorite gold necklace to help pay his business registration fees. When Daniel's company nearly collapsed, Miriam emptied her savings without hesitation. She remembered the tiny apartment where rain leaked through the ceiling, forcing them to place cooking pots beneath the dripping roof. Daniel had once laughed and said, "Look at us. We have indoor waterfalls." Miriam had laughed with him because they had little money but plenty of hope. Now, watching him arrive with Vanessa, she wondered when that man had disappeared. Inside the courthouse, Daniel avoided her eyes as the divorce papers were placed before them. Miriam slowly pushed the documents toward him. "Do you remember our first apartment?" she asked. Daniel sighed. "Miriam, please, don't make this harder." She swallowed the pain in her throat. "You said those buckets made our apartment look luxurious." For a second, the corner of his mouth lifted, remembering the old days. Then Vanessa appeared at the doorway and checked her expensive watch. The smile vanished from Daniel's face. He picked up the pen and signed. Miriam stared at his signature, remembering the same hand that had once held hers beneath a street lamp, while promising, "We'll build our future together." When Daniel finished signing, Miriam took the papers and stood. Her eyes were filled with tears, but she refused to let them fall. "Congratulations, Daniel," she whispered. He looked confused. "For what?" Miriam forced a small smile. "You finally got everything you wanted." She walked toward the courthouse doors without looking back. Outside, the rain had become heavier, washing the pavement clean as she stepped into the storm alone. Daniel remained inside, staring after her, unaware that the woman he had just discarded would one day become the person standing far above him. He had chosen a billionaire because he believed money could guarantee his future. He did not know that, on that rainy afternoon, he had just signed away the most valuable thing he would ever have. 2 years later, Daniel would remember one sentence from the night he divorced Miriam. "You finally got everything you wanted." At the time, he had laughed at it. Now, standing inside a mansion worth millions while staring at a bank statement showing a balance of $7.42, he finally understood what she meant. But before his world collapsed, Daniel was still living the life he had sacrificed everything to obtain, and he was about to discover that the billionaire he had chosen had a secret far more dangerous than money. The Sterling mansion glittered beneath hundreds of golden lights as Vanessa hosted an extravagant party. Celebrities, politicians, investors, and business executives filled the marble hall while champagne flowed freely. Daniel stood beside Vanessa, smiling for cameras as reporters praised their engagement. "You are a very lucky man," one businessman joked. Daniel raised his glass. "I know." But when he looked across the room, his smile faded. A young couple had arrived holding hands, laughing as they struggled to balance a plate of food. For a brief moment, Daniel remembered Miriam. He remembered her cheap cooking, her terrible singing, and the way she used to steal the crispy edges from his fried chicken. He quickly pushed the memory away. Vanessa noticed. "Still thinking about your poor little wife?" she asked coldly. Daniel stiffened. "She's my past. Vanessa smiled. Good. Because your future belongs to me. Later that night, Daniel found Vanessa in her private study arguing with an unfamiliar man. The door was slightly open, and he heard the man whisper, "The transfers cannot continue. The auditors are getting suspicious." Vanessa's voice became sharp. "Then make the numbers disappear." Daniel froze outside the door. "And what about Daniel?" the man asked. There was a long silence. Vanessa finally replied, "Daniel knows nothing. If the investigation comes, everything points to his company." Daniel's blood ran cold. He slowly stepped backward before they could see him. His mind raced. Why was his company involved? What had Vanessa been hiding? Before he could find an answer, his phone suddenly rang. It was his financial director. "Daniel," the frightened voice said, "you need to come to the office immediately. Something terrible has happened." Daniel rushed downstairs, but Vanessa was already standing in the hallway, perfectly calm. "Where are you going?" she asked. "The office." Her eyes narrowed. "Don't go." Daniel stopped. "Why?" Vanessa stepped closer and whispered, "Because if you walk out that door tonight, Daniel, you may never be able to come back." He stared at her, realizing for the first time that the woman he had left Miriam for might not love him at all. Outside, police sirens suddenly screamed through the night. Red and blue lights flashed across the mansion windows. Daniel turned toward the sound, his heart pounding. Vanessa's face lost its color. Then Daniel's phone received a message that would change his life forever. "Your company accounts have been frozen. You are under investigation." The message on Daniel's phone seemed to burn through the screen. "Your company accounts have been frozen. You are under investigation." For several seconds, he could not breathe. "Vanessa," he whispered, turning toward her, "what did you do?" She stared at him without answering. Then she slowly walked to the bar, poured herself a drink, and said, "You should never have gone to the office." Daniel's stomach tightened. "What does that mean?" Vanessa took a sip and looked directly into his eyes. "It means, Daniel, that you should have stayed exactly where I put you." Before he could respond, the front doors burst open and investigators entered the mansion. Daniel watched in disbelief as they carried boxes of documents from Vanessa's father's office. The life he had believed was perfect was beginning to crumble before his eyes. By sunrise, the mansion was surrounded by reporters. Daniel's photograph appeared on every news channel. Businessman linked to billion-dollar fraud investigation. His phone would not stop ringing, but every call brought worse news. His business partners abandoned him. His investors demanded their money. The bank froze his personal accounts. Even Vanessa had disappeared. Daniel stood in an empty hotel room wearing yesterday's suit, staring at a television that showed his former mansion being searched. "She used me," he whispered. Then another memory struck him. The day he had signed the divorce papers. Miriam had looked into his eyes and said, "You finally got everything you wanted." Daniel closed his eyes. For the first time, he understood how foolish he had been. He had traded a woman who loved him for a woman who only wanted what his name could provide. Across the city, Miriam knew nothing about Daniel's collapse. She was standing in the kitchen of a tiny rented restaurant, supervising her first major catering order. "Careful with those trays," she shouted as two young employees rushed past each other. Her best friend Grace walked in carrying a stack of receipts. "Miriam, I have good news." Miriam wiped flour from her hands. "If it's another bill, please tell it to wait until tomorrow." Grace laughed. "No bill. We just received an order from the largest hotel in the city." Miriam stared at her. "How many meals?" Grace smiled. 500. Miriam's mouth fell open. 500. Yes. Miriam looked around the tiny kitchen. "We don't even have enough plates for 50. Grace shrugged. "Then I suggest we start praying for plates." Miriam burst out laughing. She had no idea that this small order would become the beginning of an empire, and that the man who once told her she was holding him back would soon come knocking at her door. That evening, as Miriam locked the restaurant, a black sedan stopped across the street. She frowned when a man stepped out and approached her. He was wearing a dark suit and carrying a leather folder. "Are you Miriam?" he asked. "Yes." "Who are you?" The man handed her a document. "My name is Edward Hale. I used to manage Daniel's company." Miriam's expression immediately changed. "Why are you here?" Edward lowered his voice. Because Daniel is in trouble. Miriam stared at him. Daniel is no longer my husband. I know, Edward replied. But there is something you need to know. He opened the folder and revealed an old financial document bearing Miriam's signature. Her eyes widened. What is that? Edward looked around before answering. Your divorce may not have ended your connection to Daniel's company. In fact, you may still legally own a fortune. Miriam's hands began to tremble. She looked at the document again. Then Edward said the words that would change everything. And someone has been trying very hard to make sure you never find out. Miriam stared at the document as if it were written in another language. You're saying I still own part of Daniel's company? She asked. Edward nodded. Not just part of it. A significant portion. She shook her head. That can't be true. Daniel owned the company. Edward opened another folder. Daniel believed that too. But when you helped him start the business, you invested your savings. The original shareholder agreement listed you as a co-owner. Miriam's eyes moved across the pages until she found her name. Her hands trembled. She remembered selling her gold necklace, using her savings, and working double shifts to keep Daniel's dream alive. She had never cared about ownership. She had simply wanted her husband to succeed. Why didn't Daniel know? She whispered. Edward's expression became serious. Because someone changed the company's records shortly before your divorce. Miriam's heart began pounding. Who? Edward hesitated. Vanessa's father. Silence fell between them. Edward explained that Daniel's company had been secretly used to move money between several businesses controlled by the Sterling family. But Miriam's original shares had remained untouched because the person who altered the records had failed to completely erase the old documents. Why are you telling me this now? She asked. Edward looked toward the street. Because the investigation is getting bigger. Daniel may have lost everything. But the people responsible are trying to hide the evidence. Your documents could expose them. Miriam closed the folder. Then why don't you give them to the police? Edward gave a bitter smile. Because some of the people investigating this case have been bought. Miriam's face hardened. She was frightened, but beneath the fear something else was growing. Determination. Meanwhile, Daniel had spent 3 nights in a cheap hotel room, unable to sleep. The luxury apartment he once occupied was gone. His credit cards were useless. His friends had stopped answering his calls. He stared at an old photograph on his phone, the only photograph he had left of himself and Miriam. He remembered her standing beside him on the day they opened his first tiny office. She had been wearing an old yellow dress and holding 2 cups of cheap coffee. One day, she had told him, "We'll look back at this and laugh." Daniel touched the screen. "I'm sorry, Miriam." A knock interrupted him. He opened the door and found Edward standing there. "We need to talk." Daniel stepped aside. "Is there anything left to save?" Edward entered and placed a folder on the table. "Maybe, but there's one person who can help you." Daniel opened the folder. When he saw Miriam's name, his face went pale. "No." Edward nodded. "Yes." The next morning, Miriam arrived at her restaurant before sunrise. She expected to spend the day worrying about lawyers and missing documents. Instead, she found 20 employees waiting outside. Grace stepped forward. "We have a problem." Miriam sighed. "What now?" Grace pointed toward the road. "That." A line of expensive cars had stopped outside the restaurant. Reporters poured out, cameras flashing. One reporter shouted, "Miriam, is it true that you are the secret owner of Daniel's former company?" Another yelled, "Did you know your ex-husband is being investigated for fraud?" Miriam froze. She had never spoken to the media. She looked at Grace, then at the cameras. Before she could answer, a black car stopped directly in front of her. The door opened. Daniel stepped out. He looked exhausted, thinner, and completely different from the arrogant man who had walked out of the courthouse years earlier. Their eyes met across the crowd. Daniel took one step toward her and said quietly, "Miriam, I know I have no right to ask you for anything, but you're the only person who can save me." Miriam stared at Daniel as the reporters shouted questions around them. For a moment, the noise disappeared. She saw only the man she had once loved, the man who had promised to build a future with her, then abandoned her for wealth. Now his expensive clothes were gone, his confidence had disappeared, and there was fear in his eyes. Miriam folded her arms. "Save you," she repeated. Daniel nodded. I know what I did to you. I know I don't deserve your help. Grace leaned toward Miriam and whispered, if you want, I can throw him into the street. Miriam almost smiled. Tempting. Daniel heard her and managed a weak laugh. I probably deserve that. But Miriam's expression became serious. Come inside. We are not discussing this in front of cameras. As they entered the restaurant, Daniel noticed the walls covered with photographs of Miriam's growing business. He looked around in disbelief. You built all this? Miriam replied, while you were busy becoming rich. Inside her office, Daniel sat across from her while Grace stood near the door with her arms folded. Miriam placed Edward's documents on the desk. Tell me everything. Daniel hesitated. Vanessa's family used my company to move money illegally. I didn't know. Miriam's eyes narrowed. You expect me to believe you? Daniel shook his head. No. I expect you to believe the evidence. He explained how Vanessa had convinced him to sign documents he barely read. He admitted that he had been blinded by money and ambition. I thought Vanessa could give me a better life, he said quietly. And what did I give you? Miriam asked. Daniel looked at the floor. Nothing. Exactly. Silence filled the room. Then Miriam pushed the documents toward him. These shares belonged to me before we divorced. If I help you, it won't be because we're getting back together. It will be because I won't let criminals destroy what I worked for. Daniel nodded. I understand. That afternoon, Miriam and Daniel met Edward at a small law office. Edward revealed something even more disturbing. The original company records showed that Miriam's investment had been used to purchase the first major technology contract that made Daniel's company successful. Without her money, there would never have been an empire for Vanessa's family to exploit. But there was a missing page. Someone removed the final shareholder agreement, Edward said. Miriam frowned. Where is it? Edward looked at Daniel. We believe Vanessa has it. Daniel's face tightened. Where is she? Edward slid a photograph across the table. It showed Vanessa entering a private airport with a suitcase. She left the country 2 days ago. Miriam studied the picture. Then why would she keep the document? Edward's voice dropped. Because the document doesn't just prove that Miriam owns the shares. It also contains the name of the person who helped her father hide the money. Daniel stared at him. Who? Edward shook his head. I don't know. But if Vanessa destroys that document, the truth may disappear with it. That night, Miriam returned home and found an envelope beneath her door. There was no name on it. No address. Just one sentence written across the front. Stop looking into Daniel's company. Her hands went cold. She opened it carefully. Inside was a photograph of Grace leaving the restaurant earlier that day. On the back, another message had been written. Next time, it won't be a photograph. Miriam's breathing stopped. She immediately called Grace, but there was no answer. She called again. Nothing. Then her phone rang. It was Daniel. Miriam, where are you? At home. His voice became urgent. Don't open your door. I'm coming. She frowned. Why? Daniel paused. Because Edward just discovered something. What? His answer sent a chill through her entire body. The person behind this isn't Vanessa's father. He's been dead for 6 months. Miriam's hand tightened around the phone. What do you mean he's been dead for 6 months? She asked. Daniel's voice was low and urgent. Edward found records showing that Vanessa's father died before the biggest transfers happened. Someone has been using his identity. Miriam looked again at the threatening photograph on her table. Then who was behind this? Daniel replied, We don't know yet. But Edward believes the person has access to the Sterling family's private accounts. A loud knock suddenly struck Miriam's front door. She froze. Another knock followed. Miriam, Daniel said through the phone. Don't open it. I'm almost there. She quietly switched off the lights and moved away from the door. Then she heard a familiar voice outside. Miriam, it's Grace. Relief washed over her. She opened the door, and Grace rushed inside, breathing heavily. I've been calling you. My phone died. Miriam stared at her. Someone photographed you. Grace looked at the picture on the table. Her smile disappeared. Oh. Minutes later, Daniel arrived with Edward. The 4 of them gathered around Miriam's kitchen table while rain hammered against the windows. Edward placed a laptop on the table. I traced the money transfers, he said. They all lead to a private holding company. Daniel leaned closer. Who owns it? Edward hesitated. That's the problem. The company is registered under 3 different names, but all 3 identities are fake. Miriam frowned. Then how do we find the real owner? Edward opened another file. We follow the money backward. After several minutes, he stopped at a transaction made nearly 4 years earlier. There. Miriam leaned forward. A name appeared on the screen. Jonathan Sterling. Daniel stared at it. Vanessa's younger brother? Edward nodded. The family always said Jonathan disappeared after a business dispute. But he didn't disappear. Years later, Miriam stood on the balcony of her thriving company, watching the sunset turn the city gold. Daniel stood beside her, no longer the arrogant man who had abandoned her for a billionaire, but a humble businessman who had rebuilt his life from nothing. The truth about Jonathan had finally been exposed, the stolen fortune recovered, and the people responsible had faced justice. Miriam had become more than successful. She had become a woman who used her success to help others rise. Daniel looked at her and smiled. Do you ever regret leaving me? He asked jokingly. Miriam laughed. You left me. He nodded. Right. Still learning. They both laughed. She looked toward the horizon and whispered, sometimes losing someone is the very thing that teaches you not to lose yourself. Daniel smiled. He had once believed money was everything. Now he knew the greatest wealth was character, loyalty, and the courage to begin again. But there was one final mystery Miriam never forgot, the second signature on the shareholder agreement. Who had secretly helped Jonathan? And why had that person protected Miriam's ownership for all those years? Even after the case was closed, the answer remained hidden. Perhaps some secrets are meant to become another story. And if this story touched your heart, remember this. Never allow rejection, poverty, betrayal, or someone else's opinion to convince you that you are worthless. Your beginning does not determine your ending. If you enjoyed Miriam's journey, like this story, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that their best chapter may still be ahead. And tell us in the comments, if you were Miriam, would you have forgiven Daniel, or walked away forever?